They suddenly told me to move my boat just like that. After 12 peaceful years in this neighborhood, the HOA decided my boat was now some sort of visual blight. This was the same boat I'd cared for and kept neatly docked in the marina for over a decade. Can you believe it? But here's the thing, they had no idea who they were dealing with. I wasn't the type to just roll over, so I took a step they never saw coming. I locked down the only marina they depend on. I knew things might get messy, but at that point, I didn't care. The letter showed up on a Tuesday morning in March. The moment I saw the whole letterhead, my stomach twisted. I had no reason to expect anything from HOA. I always paid my dues on time and kept my property in good shape. The envelope felt heavier than usual, which should have been my first sign trouble was brewing. Coffee in hand, I sat at the kitchen table ready to skim whatever bureaucratic nonsense they'd cooked up. What I found inside was so ridiculous, I actually laughed out loud. Looking back, maybe I should have taken it seriously right away. "Dear Mr. Harris," it began, in that stiff, overly formal tone they used when they wanted to sound powerful. "It has come to the attention of the HOA board that your vessel, currently docked at Slip 23, creates an aesthetic disturbance that negatively affects our community's visual appeal and property values." I read that line 3 times before it sank in. How could my well-maintained boat, something I owned for over 10 years, suddenly be an issue? The letter demanded I remove it within 28 days or face appropriate enforcement action. The insult didn't stop there. The next paragraph claimed multiple residents had complained about oversized watercraft disrupting the community's appearance standards. Oversized watercraft. My 35-foot fishing boat, used maybe twice a month, was apparently destroying everyone's quality of life. I glanced out the kitchen window toward the marina, where about 40 other boats sat quietly in their slips, some much larger than mine, others in worse shape, yet somehow mine was the chosen villain. At the time, I was just baffled. I headed down to the marina to figure out what had sparked this sudden outrage. The morning air was crisp, one of those perfect Florida days that reminded me why I moved here in the first place, occasional HOA drama aside. When I reached Slip 23, I studied my boat like I was one of these concerned residents. Freshly painted white with blue trim, tidy deck, everything neatly stowed, hardly an eyesore. The dock itself was spotless. Nothing about it screamed aesthetic disturbance. But apparently, I wasn't sophisticated enough to grasp the vision of Angela Brooks and her board. I wandered the marina for 20 minutes, comparing my boat to the others. Fishing boats, pontoons, sailboats, even a few small yachts much larger than mine. Some cost far more, others were weathered and aging, yet all existed peacefully side by side. Angela Brooks was waiting in the marina office when I arrived. I knew right then something wasn't right. She'd been HOA president for 3 years, ever since moving here from somewhere up north. Always perfectly put together, mid-50s, with that air of constant authority, whether she was heading to a meeting or just walking her little designer dog. "Mr. Harris, I'm so glad I caught you," she said with a practiced smile that never touched her eyes. "I assume you received our letter about your boat situation?" The way she said situation made it sound like I was hiding contraband, not owning a fishing boat. "Yes, I did, Miss Brooks," I replied, trying to keep my tone calm despite my irritation. "But I have to admit, I'm a little confused about what exactly the issue is." She gestured dramatically toward my boat, as though the problem should be obvious to anyone. "Well, as you can see, it's rather large and dominates the marina's visual landscape in a way some residents find concerning." I glanced at the other boats again, genuinely trying to see her point. "Miss Brooks, there are at least 6 boats here bigger than mine, and several in worse condition. What makes mine different?" Her smile faltered just slightly, revealing something sharper beneath the polished exterior. "Mr. Harris, sometimes the spirit of community rules and neighborhood harmony matters more than the precise letter of the law. We are working toward a certain standard here, and your vessel doesn't fit our vision for the neighborhood's future." That spirit versus letter of the law line stuck with me. It was basically an admission they had no actual written rule to back this up. "In that case," I said evenly, "I suggest you rewrite the rules to make them clear and specific, Miss Brooks." For now, as far as I was concerned, my boat wasn't going anywhere. Maybe I should have played it more diplomatically, tried to find a middle ground, but Angela's smug tone and hazy accusations only fueled my stubborn streak. From there, the conversation spiraled to Angela insisting that reasonable people understood the need for compromise and community unity, while I countered that reasonable people actually followed their own clearly written rules and procedures. At one point, she tossed around talk of legal action and enforcement options available to the HOA, but I'd stopped listening closely. My attention had shifted to something else, a detail about the marina that suddenly didn't feel right. The property boundaries didn't quite match what I remembered, and the signs posted around looked oddly generic, more like something from a commercial facility than an HOA-owned community space. No HOA logos, no neighborhood branding, just standard marina operation signs. I mentally bookmarked the observation, not yet sure why it seemed important. When Angela finally stormed off, clearly frustrated that I wasn't bowing to her demands, I stayed behind and examined the marina more closely. On the surface, everything looked legitimate and well kept, but something about the ownership structure didn't sit right. The more I replayed our conversation, the more suspicious I became about what the HOA actually controlled. 28 days to remove my boat? Fine. I'd spend that time finding out exactly who held the real authority here and whether their threats carried any legal weight. Something told me, though, that what I uncovered might be far more tangled than I was ready for. The next letter arrived exactly a week later, almost as if it were part of a carefully timed escalation plan. This one was colder, more aggressive. Angela clearly wasn't planning to back down. "Dear Mr. Harris," it opened, with an icy precision, "your failure to respond appropriately to our previous correspondence regarding your vessel has left us with no choice but to escalate this matter to the next level of enforcement." The rest spelled out the threat: daily fines of $500 starting on day 30, accompanied by glossy, professional photographs of my boat labeled visual evidence of my supposed violation. Those photos were almost comical in a twisted way. They'd been shot with a wide-angle lens, making my fishing boat look like a looming monster. The lighting cast heavy shadows, turning the marina into a scene from a horror movie about killer boats. Every flaw had been exaggerated, each angle chosen to make my vessel seem like a grotesque intrusion on the neighborhood's charm. I had to give them points for creativity, even if the photography was shamelessly biased. But what truly bothered me wasn't the photos, it was realizing someone had been sneaking around the marina, taking them without my consent. The thought was unsettling, even creepy. Were they photographing other residents' property, too? How long had this quiet surveillance been going on? The whole thing had a Big Brother feel, and I began wondering whether this was just the start of Angela's power grab. So I shifted gears. If they wanted to play this game, I'd get methodical. With a few well-placed calls to contacts I'd built in the marine contracting industry, I accessed county property records for the entire Lakeside Estates development and the surrounding area. What I found was both intriguing and troubling. The marina wasn't listed as HOA common property in any of the original documents from the early 90s, when the neighborhood was first built. Instead, county records showed it belonged to a company called Coastal Properties LLC, an entity formed just 2 years ago. The timing was more than suspicious, given Angela's relatively recent arrival and her sudden obsession with improving the marina's aesthetics. Digging deeper into Coastal Properties LLC, the puzzle pieces didn't quite fit. The more records I cross-checked, the stranger the picture became. The more I compared the county records with the HOA's own documents, the more uneasy I became. If the marina didn't actually belong to the HOA, what authority did Angela and her board have to dictate which boats could dock there or how it should be run? Even stranger, why were residents paying steep HOA fees specifically earmarked for marina upkeep if the HOA didn't actually own or control it? I began compiling a detailed list of every inconsistency I uncovered. What emerged was a picture very different from the transparent, well-managed neighborhood I thought I'd moved into all those years ago. The next afternoon, Angela intercepted me at the mailbox a little too conveniently. It made me wonder if she'd been watching my house, waiting for the perfect moment to corner me. "Mr. Harris, you're making this far more difficult than it needs to be for everyone," she said, wearing the polished, faux concerned expression she seemed to keep on standby for these run-ins. "Just move the boat to another marina, and we can all live like civilized neighbors who respect community standards. The way she lingered on the word civilized rubbed me the wrong way, as though she was implying I was some sort of disruptive outsider for daring to ask where her authority came from. "If you can't show me a written rule, we're done," I said flatly. "The boat stays." I already knew she had no such rule to produce here because it didn't exist. Her reaction was telling. Rather than quote any specific bylaw or provision from official HOA paperwork, she launched into vague platitudes about community standards and understood expectations that apparently everyone else just accepted without question. When I pressed for details, so who created these unwritten rules, when, and why, her composure cracked. She grew flustered, muttered something under her breath, and walked off without answering a single one of my questions. That exchange erased any doubt in my mind. This wasn't about aesthetics or legitimate neighborhood governance. Angela was hiding something big, and this so-called boat problem was just a smokescreen. Over the next few days, I started speaking with other residents. I wanted to know if anyone else had noticed questionable practices in the HOA's operations or in Angela's leadership. Most were sympathetic but hesitant to get involved, viewing the conflict as a personal dispute between me and the board. Bob Thompson, a retired accountant down the street, advised me to just move the boat and save myself the legal headache. Mary Williams, a local elementary school teacher, was more open. She admitted she shared my concerns but was wary of retaliation. "Angela's been pushing a lot of new restrictions lately," Mary confided. "Last month she tried to ban decorative garden sculptures. Before that, she wanted new limits on exterior paint colors and landscaping. Then came the third letter, this time on imposing legal letterhead from a firm called McCoy Associates. It threatened full legal action to enforce community standards and protect property values across lakeside estates." The tone was colder, more calculated, clearly designed to intimidate rather than inform. Buried in the heavy legal jargon was the same glaring omission, no reference to any actual written rule I'd violated. Instead, it relied on vague terms like reasonable community expectations and established aesthetic precedent, which sounded official but meant absolutely nothing. I had to admit, the letter was well crafted and intimidating, but once you stripped away the formal tone, it was just another empty threat built on non-existent regulations. That's when I decided it was time to dig much deeper into Coastal Properties LLC. The timing of everything gnawed at me. Angela becoming HOA president 3 years ago, Coastal Properties suddenly appearing on record 2 years ago, and now, the marina being painted as a pressing problem that demanded immediate action, immediate aesthetic improvements and tighter control. Angela's favorite phrases. I don't believe in coincidences, especially when they involve big money and a perfectly choreographed drama meant to push residents into submission. McCoy Associates, huh? I started to wonder how many other neighborhoods they'd helped with similar makeovers and management crackdowns. But a small voice in my head warned that I might be stepping into something far bigger than I was ready to handle. My digging into Coastal Properties LLC pulled me straight into a rabbit hole I never expected. What began as mild curiosity about who owned the marina turned into something deeply personal and far more alarming than I could have imagined. Days of combing through Florida business filings, cross-checking property records, and following paper trails that seemed intentionally tangled finally led me to the truth. Coastal Properties wasn't some faceless corporation or distant investment firm. The name listed on the official incorporation papers stopped me cold. Owner, Hannah Brooks, a 26-year-old law student at the University of Florida. Brooks, a broken bars in Angela Brooks, Angela's daughter, a person I had never once heard mentioned in 3 years of neighborhood meetings and casual encounters. Suddenly, everything about Angela's evasiveness made sense. This wasn't about community standards or beautifying the marina. It was a calculated family scheme designed to funnel value and control into their own pockets. I sat in my office staring at those documents, trying to absorb what I'd uncovered. Angela had been using her position as HOA president to manufacture problems with community property, and then her daughter would conveniently appear with a solution of buying those properties at bargain prices. It was devious, unethical, and frighteningly clever. The longer I thought about it, the more disgusted and grudgingly impressed I became with the scope of their plan. I began to wonder how many other neighborhoods they'd run this same play on. and how much money they'd pulled in from residents too wary or too afraid to fight. The paper trail made it clear this wasn't amateur work. It was a refined business model. Hannah's name appeared on the deeds of common properties in 3 other HOA communities within a 50-mile radius, all acquired for suspiciously low amounts from struggling developers or desperate HOA boards. Each case followed the same pattern. Angela stepped into a leadership or consulting role. A crisis appeared, whether it was safety issues, unsightly property, or expensive repairs, and then a young, well-positioned buyer swooped in to save the community. Local newspapers painted each deal as a win-win, but it was obvious who the real winners were: Angela and her daughter. Even the news articles were suspicious. The language was always eerily similar, as if pulled from a template. The timing was precise, the solutions too convenient, and the public narrative too neatly packaged to be anything but staged. The betrayal stung more than I expected. For over a decade, I'd paid my dues, followed every legitimate rule, and believed I was helping build a good neighborhood. All the while, Angela had been smiling to my face, shaking my hand at barbecues, and quietly plotting how to strip this community of valuable assets. I knew then I had to confront her. Maybe there was some angle I hadn't considered, or maybe when faced with undeniable proof she'd come clean. I sent her an email attaching every corporate document I'd found. My subject line was short and deliberate: "Interesting family business you have there." I kept my tone firm but not outright accusatory, leaving her just enough space to respond before I involved the rest of the neighborhood or the authorities. Her reply came quickly, too quickly. Within hours, my phone rang. Angela's voice was tight, the kind of strained calm someone uses when panic is bubbling just below the surface. Angela tried to hold on to her usual authoritative tone. "Mr. Harris, my daughter's business activities are completely separate from my role in the HOA," she insisted, but there was a tremor in her voice that gave her away. "This is harassment and an invasion of privacy. If you continue, I'll have no choice but to report you to the authorities." The irony was almost too much. Angela threatening to call the authorities while she might very well be committing fraud herself. Still, the urgency in her tone told me everything I needed to know. She was rattled, and she was taking my discovery very seriously. I could almost hear the gears turning in her mind, scrambling to gauge how much I knew and what I might do next. Part of me wanted to laugh at the absurdity of her accusing me of harassment after weeks of sending me threatening letters and surveillance photos, but I kept my reply measured and professional. "Miss Brooks, I'm simply trying to determine who actually owns the marina, and on what authority you're making demands about my boat," I said calmly. "These are public records, not private matters. Residents have a right to know how community property is being handled." Her deflections and intimidation attempts only confirmed what I suspected. She knew the optics were terrible and was desperate to contain the situation before anyone else caught on. Instead of retreating or seeking some middle ground, I went on the offensive. I formally requested an HOA board meeting to review marina policies and fee structures in light of these new ownership revelations. In essence, I was giving Angela one last opportunity to address the issue openly before I took the matter further. The email I sent to all board members was polite but unmistakably pointed, framed as routine administrative business while clearly signaling that the stakes were high. The reaction from the community was swift and far more supportive than I'd expected. Word traveled quickly that I'd uncovered something unusual about the marina's ownership. Neighbors began asking their own questions about where their HOA dues were going. Several approached me privately to share concerns about Angela's questionable decisions and high-handed management style over the years. The image of a united, harmonious neighborhood was beginning to crumble. Still, I couldn't ignore the risk. By openly suggesting that the HOA president was involved in fraud and violating her fiduciary duty, I might have been stepping into a fight with someone whose political and legal connections ran deeper than I realized. If Angela wanted to play games with bogus rules and hollow threats, I was ready to counter with actual legal strategy. But a quiet thought lingered: was I truly prepared for the level of conflict that might follow? When the board meeting finally happened, it felt less like an honest community discussion and more like a clumsy corporate damage control session. Angela had clearly spent the days beforehand rallying her allies and rehearsing defenses rather than preparing any sort of truthful explanation about the marina. The board itself was stacked entirely with her hand-picked loyalists, each placed there over the past 2 years through calculated elections and strategic appointments. Jim Patterson, a timid retired accountant, fidgeted with his papers and avoided my eyes. Lisa Rodriguez, a real estate agent whose business thrived on Angela's referrals, sat with her arms crossed, her expression defiant. Sandra Mitchell, an elderly widow who depended on Angela for social connections, looked lost but ready to vote however Angela told her to. When I presented my findings, I kept my eyes on Angela. I'd brought copies of every corporate record and property deed I'd uncovered, laying them neatly in front of the board. I handed out a detailed analysis for each board member, confident that seeing the facts laid out so clearly might spark an honest conversation about how to handle this both ethically and legally. The evidence was airtight, showing undeniable links between Angela's HOA decisions and Hannah's property acquisitions. No one could reasonably write them off as coincidence. As they flipped through the documents, I watched their expressions shift. It was clear they were realizing that this issue wasn't going to vanish with a few vague denials or procedural loopholes. Angela's reaction was exactly what I expected: defensive, evasive, and laser-focused on technicalities instead of the actual issue. Even if my daughter owns the marina, the HOA still has the right and responsibility to set community standards that protect property values and neighborhood character, she declared in the same patronizing tone she'd used before. Mr. Harris seems to think property ownership gives him license to disregard reasonable community expectations and disrupt our hard-earned harmony. Before she could say more, Jim leaned forward and spoke in a low but steady voice. This doesn't add up. The surprise flicker in Angela's eyes was unmistakably she hadn't anticipated dissent from within her own camp. I seized the moment. If there's no written rule, then this conversation ends here, I replied, knowing she couldn't produce anything in writing. The other board members shifted in their seats, clearly uncomfortable with the position Angela had put them in, being drawn into what was essentially a family business venture dressed up as community management. Jim's comment had cracked the veneer of loyalty, and I could see uncertainty spreading among the others. The next morning, the fight escalated. A courier delivered a formal cease and desist letter from McCoy Associates, far more aggressive and threatening than anything they'd sent before. It accused me of defaming Angela and her family, harassing board members with frivolous meeting requests, and warned me to remove my boat immediately or face heavy legal penalties, including civil damages. It was pure intimidation designed to silence me rather than address the very real concerns I'd raised about property ownership and HOA authority. What stood out was what the letter didn't say. It never challenged the truth of my findings about Coastal Properties LLC. Instead of denying the family connection or explaining the business arrangement, they threatened legal action for sharing public records with other residents. That alone told me just how worried they were about this getting out. I refused to back down. Using my business experience and connections with regulatory agencies, I filed a formal complaint with the Florida Department of Business and Professional Regulation, citing potential ethics violations by HOA board members using their roles for a personal gain. I also requested a county-level investigation into HOA fee collection for services performed on privately owned properties. The complaints required me to organize my evidence into a detailed, coherent narrative, showing exactly how the scheme operated. Putting it into legal language made the scale of the operation even clearer and more damning than I'd initially realized. This wasn't a single bad decision. This was an ongoing, well-coordinated fraud scheme that had been running for years across multiple communities. Every document revealed another layer of deception, exposing just how profitably and deeply entrenched this operation had become. I mentioned to a few neighbors that I'd come across similar cases before, and that I'd even seen comparable situations covered on Anadrama Nest, which focused on HOA overreach and disputes over community property. The pattern was striking: manufactured crises followed by convenient solutions that just happened to benefit certain individuals. Angela and Hannah's tactics weren't as unique as they liked to think. Digging deeper into McCoy Associates uncovered an even darker truth. They'd represented multiple HOAs in Central Florida during property transfers that followed the exact same formula I'd uncovered in our neighborhood. They marketed it as community asset optimization, which in practice meant moving valuable properties into private hands at bargain prices. Their website even boasted glowing testimonials from satisfied communities claiming they'd solved maintenance and liability headaches through creative property management solutions. Meanwhile, Angela's desperation was becoming impossible to miss. As the legal and public pressure mounted, she started personally calling residents, warning them that I was out to destroy property values and drag the community into costly lawsuits that would lead to higher fees for everyone. Her scare campaign, however, was about to blow up in her face. Most neighbors were sharp enough to see that Angela herself had created the legal mess through her shady business dealings. Several told me about her phone calls, so how frantic and almost desperate she sounded as she tried to rally support. The more she talked, the more obvious it became that she was losing control of the narrative and was terrified of the legal consequences her actions could bring down on her. The community's reaction wasn't as united as I'd hoped, but it was still a step in the right direction. Many residents now openly backed me after reviewing the documented proof of the family business ties and questionable property ownership. Others stuck by Angela, either out of fear she might retaliate or because they truly believed she'd been acting in the community's best interest. And then there was a large group who just wanted the matter to quietly disappear so they could enjoy their retirement without all the legal headaches and neighbor disputes. What shook me the most, though, was finding critical details buried in the original neighborhood planning records from 1992, documents I had only just managed to get from the county planning department. Hidden in the dry, technical language of surveys and zoning rules was a provision that could completely flip the legal standing of this entire conflict if I was interpreting it correctly. But if I'd misunderstood, the risk was enormous. This wasn't just about losing my boat dock anymore. This could backfire in ways I wasn't sure I was ready to face. Then came the breakthrough I hadn't dared to expect. Tucked away in those decades-old plans was a 20-foot wide public access easement cutting directly through what's now the marina area, guaranteeing community access to Lake Harmony for recreation. This easement had never been abandoned or legally transferred, which meant no private party could ever have full control over lake access, no matter who owned the marina. That revelation completely shifted the power balance. If the easement still stood, Angela and Hannah's whole plan to privatize and profit from marina operations was not just unethical, it was flat-out illegal. They couldn't charge exclusive fees, block boats, or enforce arbitrary rules on residents who had the right to use the lake. Most importantly, they had no authority to threaten the removal of my boat when I had the legal right to dock there under the easement. This was the leverage I'd been waiting for. I dove into researching easement law and consulted a property attorney who specialized in community development disputes. The legal principles were complicated but clear. Public access easements create permanent rights that run with the land and can't be eliminated without a formal process involving multiple government bodies. In fact, the fact that residents had been freely using the marina for over 3 decades only strengthened the case under adverse possession and prescriptive easement laws. Angela and Hannah had unknowingly stepped straight into a legal trap. I wasn't about to waste the opportunity. Using my marine contractor license, I filed an application with the county building department for an emergency dock safety inspection permit. I cited concerns over the aging dock structures and potential safety hazards. Under county rules, any commercial marina with public complaints must undergo a full safety inspection, and my professional credentials gave my request immediate credibility. Within the day, the county approved my application, granting me official authority to conduct a 48-hour structural inspection of the entire marina. That meant I could legally restrict access for safety reasons while carrying out my review. The inspection shut down Angela and Hannah's marina operation just as completely as they'd tried to shut down my boat access. I had the law on my side, and the county's full support. With the paperwork filed, I grabbed the roll of bright yellow caution tape. The next step was clear. This would be my decisive move. I showed up at the marina early Saturday morning armed with county inspection notices, caution tape, and a clipboard stacked with technical documents. In a matter of hours, The lively community gathering spot was transformed into a restricted work zone. Official signs announced that access was prohibited until mandatory safety inspections were complete. The impact was immediate and hard to ignore. Real people could see that something big was happening. The community's reaction came fast and loud, just as I'd expected. By midday, Angela was being bombarded with furious calls from more than 80 residents who were locked out of their boats on what should have been a perfect weekend at the lake. A birthday celebration had to be scrapped, the monthly fishing tournament was postponed, and several families with out-of-town guests found themselves unable to enjoy the waterfront activities they'd planned. The very marina Angela claimed she was protecting was now closed off illegally because of my actions. Angela's attempts to undo my permit were frantic. She rang the county building department 3 times a day, demanding they revoke my authority and restore access. When officials confirmed my credentials were valid and my safety concerns legitimate, she escalated to threatening legal action against the county for violating private property rights. The irony wasn't lost on any as she was now insisting on property rights she had been denying residents for months. Her argument tied her in knots. She couldn't claim the marina belonged to the HOA, because records clearly showed it was owned by Hannah. She couldn't argue residents had no right to safety inspections, because that would contradict her own claims about community oversight. Every defense she tried only revealed more contradictions and exposed the fraudulent nature of her operation. Even her legal team at McCoy and Associates seemed to realize she was cornered. Word around the neighborhood was that they'd advised her to negotiate a compromise, since her legal standing was getting weaker with every regulatory document I filed. That admission alone undercut months of aggressive threats and intimidation. It exposed them as nothing more than bluffs designed to pressure me into backing down. By Sunday, the pushback from residents was more intense than I could have imagined. Neighbors started asking direct questions about the marina fees they'd been paying for years. The most common one: if the HOA doesn't own the property, is it even legal for them to collect this money? People began talking about demanding refunds, contacting consumer protection agencies, and organizing to remove Angela from the HOA board altogether. I was pleased with the momentum, but I also knew it was just the beginning. The county inspector was scheduled to arrive Monday morning for a full marina safety review, a process I suspected would turn into a deeper investigation into property management practices, uncovering the real scope of Angela and Hannah's scheme. What began as a 48-hour inspection was about to evolve into something far more serious. Still, I couldn't ignore the feeling that I had just painted a massive target on my back. I'd set off the equivalent of a legal and political detonation in the community, and no one could predict exactly how the fallout would land. Monday's developments blew past my most optimistic expectations. The inspector who arrived wasn't there for a routine safety check. He'd been assigned to investigate possible regulatory violations tied to running an unauthorized commercial marina on residentially zoned property. My original complaint had triggered a full-scale review that could lead to criminal charges and civil penalties strong enough to wipe out their entire business model. The findings were even worse for them than anything I had uncovered on my own. Multiple safety violations were documented, each one adding to the growing list of problems Angela and Hannah could no longer ignore. The inspector's report called for immediate corrective action before the marina could reopen to the public. The electrical systems failed to meet commercial safety codes, the dock flotation units showed alarming structural wear, and the fire safety equipment was nowhere near adequate for the number of boats docked there. These weren't small oversights, as they were serious hazards that could easily result in injury or even death if left unaddressed. Worse still, the inspection uncovered that Hannah had been running a commercial marina without the permits, licenses, or insurance required for public facilities. The county had zero record of any business license, environmental impact review, or commercial liability coverage, basic requirements for any legitimate marina. This meant residents paying for marina services had no legal protection if an accident happened, and the entire operation violated zoning laws that banned commercial activity in residential areas. My research into Coastal Properties LLC brought the bigger picture into sharp focus. Angela, along with McCoy and Associates, had been using the exact same scheme in multiple Florida communities. Over the past 5 years, They'd acquired properties worth more than $1.5 million through below-market purchases triggered by manufactured crisis claims of skyrocketing maintenance costs, fabricated safety risks, or exaggerated insurance liabilities. Hannah's name appeared as the sole owner of the company in the incorporation records. She held title to marinas, clubhouses, and recreational properties in 6 different HOA neighborhoods, all purchased at deep discounts after these staged emergencies. Angela had always been involved, either as an HOA board member, board president, or paid consultant during the property transfers. McCoy and Associates handled the legal side for every single deal, always representing the HOA boards rather than the buyers, a blatant conflict of interest that trampled professional ethics. It didn't take long for the press to get wind of the scandal. A regional newspaper reporter, tipped off after hearing about the county's involvement, ran the story front and center under the headline, "HOA Power Grab: How Mother-Daughter Team Allegedly Profited from Community Property." The article included photos of Angela's home, Hannah's corporate filings, and a detailed breakdown of their property acquisitions. It portrayed them as skilled con artists with a polished system for exploiting homeowners associations. The emergency home meeting that followed drew over 200 residents, of the largest turnout I'd ever seen. Angela's support base had completely evaporated, save for a few personal friends who looked more embarrassed than loyal. By that point, the dots connected themselves. This wasn't about enforcing community rules, it was a calculated financial scheme. The documentation was so detailed and damning that even her remaining defenders had no credible argument. Angela's final attempt at damage control was a disaster. She stood before the packed room, claiming the accusations were lies from a bitter troublemaker trying to avoid paying HOA fees and following community standards. But her shaky voice and trembling hands betrayed her. Everyone could see she was lying. The backlash was immediate. Residents demanded she resign from the HOA board at once and called for a full independent audit of the association's finances going back 5 years. A no-confidence vote passed by an overwhelming majority of 187 to 11, with most dissenters simply questioning the legality of the process, not defending her. The verdict was crystal clear. The community had lost all trust in Angela's leadership. The killing blow came with the revelation that Angela had collected $68,000 in HOA fees supposedly for marina maintenance and upgrades, despite the fact that the HOA didn't own or even control the marina property. Residents realized they'd been paying for upkeep on something the association had no rights to in the first place. It became undeniable that the marina was being run as a private business for Angela's family's personal gain. The financial fraud was now both clear and measurable, leaving criminal prosecution almost certain. The reality hit hard. This wasn't some mix-up or misunderstanding. It was deliberate deception. Residents began talking about filing lawsuits, lodging criminal complaints, and setting up safeguards to ensure nothing like this could ever happen again. That very night, Angela resigned without apology, without explanation. Her influence over the board was gone, but I knew the true reckoning was only beginning. When corruption is dragged into the light, you can't predict how far that light will reach or whose secrets it might expose, and I could feel it in my gut. This was far from over. The legal war was just starting. Over the next several months, the consequences unfolded with methodical precision, delivering the justice I'd hoped for and proving that sometimes, with enough evidence, the legal system actually works. The county audit confirmed that residents had been unlawfully charged $68,000 for marina upkeep on property the HOA didn't even own. State investigators uncovered wire fraud, breach of fiduciary duty, and a coordinated plan to defraud multiple neighborhoods through rigged property deals. Angela now faced possible charges for fraud, conspiracy, and violating her duties to the communities she claimed to represent. The state attorney's office built a case strong enough to put her at risk of felony convictions and significant prison time. Her legal costs skyrocketed as she hired high-priced attorneys to defend her in multiple jurisdictions where similar scams had taken place. The comfortable retirement she'd envisioned was evaporating into legal fees and potential restitution. Hannah's situation was even more precarious. She'd been running unlicensed commercial ventures while attending law school, triggering potential disciplinary action from the state bar that could end her legal career before it even began. The university launched its own ethics inquiry that might result in her expulsion. Her once expanding real estate holdings were now collapsing, with assets frozen and properties seized to compensate the communities she and Angela had exploited. Despite the chaos, the neighborhood began to heal. The new HOA board was voted in with overwhelming support for candidates committed to financial transparency, reduced board power, and community oversight on major decisions. I agreed to serve as an advisor on property management policies, ensuring future boards operated with integrity and within the law. McCoy and Associates didn't escape unscathed either. They received a 1-year license suspension from the state bar for enabling fraudulent property transfers while representing conflicting parties. They were ordered to contribute $15,000 to a victim restitution fund and undergo ongoing monitoring of their client dealings. Other clients of the firm soon found themselves under investigation, revealing that Angela and Hannah had been part of a wider network running similar scams. For me, the outcome was more than personal vindication. It came with tangible compensation. HOA Insurance paid me $22,000 for harassment, legal costs, and punitive damages tied to the original boat dispute that had sparked this entire investigation. It wasn't just about the money, it was official recognition that I'd been wronged and that persistence could yield justice. Angela's personal assets were frozen as civil suits piled up from multiple communities demanding repayment for fraudulent property transfers. Her home in Lakeside Estates went up for sale within weeks of her resignation, and neighbors watched movers and estate sale companies clear out her belongings. She was forced to sell at a steep loss to cover legal fees and restitution, effectively undoing the ill-gotten gains she had built over years. Hannah was compelled to sell the marina back to the community for the exact price she'd paid plus penalties. The final deal valued the property at $45,000 below its current market worth, erasing yet another piece of their profit from the scheme. The settlement also included a provision barring any member of the Brooks family from participating in community property management anywhere in Central Florida for at least a decade. The marina was now truly owned by the residents and operated transparently, with annual financial reports open to all. What followed was a complete transformation of the neighborhood, a proof that the battles I'd fought through months of tension and uncertainty had been worth it. Real estate agents began noting that buyers were specifically drawn to our community because of the strong, united response to the fraud and the new governance policies preventing anything similar from happening again. Contrary to Angela's earlier warnings, property values didn't fall, they rose, strengthened by our commitment to honest leadership. For me, the satisfaction went beyond winning a fight. It was proof that ordinary citizens, if they remain focused and persistent, can stand up to corruption and come out on top. My boat stayed right where it had always been, a slip 23, at this time with full legal protection and community backing. The new marina regulations prioritized genuine safety and environmental care rather than petty aesthetic rules or fabricated complaints from hidden sources. The facility was better maintained, more open to residents, and now actually boosted property values instead of creating expensive problems that never really existed. The day Angela's moving truck rolled away from her former home, I was working on small repairs to my boat. Her car slowed as she passed the marina for the last time. She looked straight at me, holding my gaze for about 10 seconds. In her face, I could see a blend of frustration, defeat, and reluctant acceptance. We didn't exchange a word, but the silence said enough. Justice had been done, not through revenge or petty retaliation, but through patience, persistence, and respect for the law. That evening, I sat on my deck, watching the sun dip into Lake Harmony. The marina was alive via families enjoying the water, children fishing from the docks, and neighbors gathering for spontaneous get-togethers that had been absent under Angela's heavy-handed rule. The new HOA board had just greenlit plans for a community fishing tournament, a celebration of the marina as a place that brought people together rather than driving them apart. This whole experience taught me something valuable. People often confuse kindness with weakness, and compliance with ignorance, but they eventually learn that patience, paired with a smart legal strategy, can be far more powerful than intimidation. Angela learned the hard way that a delayed response doesn't mean there won't be Onya, and that when it comes, it can be decisive. True revenge isn't about getting even, it's about ensuring justice is carried out through proper channels. Our community was healing, trust was returning, and the victory wasn't just mine, it was proof to anyone too tired or too scared to fight back that change is possible. Standing up to abuse of power doesn't just protect you, it clears the path for others to do the same. Thanks for watching Anna Drama Nest. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to like the video and subscribe for more incredible real-life tales. Until next time, keep standing up for what's right.